Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11A live lesson for today. Now, today we are working on the third lesson in the second unit, which is theme and form in early American poetry. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. So we start off in this first paragraph getting the definition of the word theme. So whenever they give you a definition, that should be one of the first things in your notes. It's the central idea of any artistic work. Sometimes it seems like a simple concept on the surface, but usually they're really big philosophical ideas that you can't, like put down in one sentence. And they give you examples here: truth or beauty. Another good example is discovery, finding out something new about yourself deep down, finding out something new about your history or your family and having to deal with that. Themes are usually bigger, thoughtful things that you can identify with in different ways. People mix this up with subjects a lot, but subjects are simple and concrete. When they say concrete, they mean it's there. It is a thing that you can identify. You can point at the thing and say, this is the subject. A theme is usually a bigger thought. So they give you an example of this based on some of the reading selections that we have gone over earlier. So the subject of Homer's Odyssey, that's one of the epic poems that we went over in another lesson. The subject is the actual Odyssey. Odyssey is a fancy word for voyage or journey. So the voyage is the actual thing that the character is doing. That is the subject. The book is about the journey of Odysseus. That is actually what it is about. If you were to give someone a summary of the book, you could actually say, this is what the book is about. That is the subject. But themes basically give you a deeper idea of how the author feels about bigger ideas that the character faces in the story. It says here, they are revealed through the author's treatment of a subject. So there's a difference between the actual subject of the story, which is what is directly happening in the story, and the author's feelings about it. So for example, maybe the theme of Odysseus could be, so like if say maybe not the Odyssey, but if you write a similar story about a voyage, if you as a person think that leaving home to adventure on your own is a bad thing, and there's only bad things waiting for people who do that. If you were to write a story about a journey, you'd probably write all kinds of bad things happening to the main character from the moment that they step foot off of their home island or something like that. So the idea, the bigger idea of it's better to stay home where it's safe or don't take your safety for granted could be a theme of the book. That's not what the book is about. What the book is about is the person who is leaving on a voyage and what happens to them. So that's the subject. The theme lets you know what the message about the subject is. Themes are consistent through a literary work and can only be identified by reading the whole thing. So you can read the beginning of a book and get a sense of what the subject is. So for example, with Harry Potter, we know that the general plot is a orphan wizard finds out that he can do magic, and he goes to a school, and this is about his life figuring out how to deal with a prophecy that joins him together with the villain, right? That is actually what happens in the book. But there are a lot of themes in Harry Potter about, like, for example, adults not listening to children or paying attention to them when they should. There are definitely themes of why it's bad to treat, like adopted children badly. There's definitely themes of being an only child, having to learn about your parents in the world through the eyes of people you know, because you don't have any connection. Like Harry is alone; he doesn't have any family connections to the wizarding world that he's a part of. And those bigger ideas are themes. So basically, they just want you to know the difference between that. There is a lesson, I think, in the English 9A tab of the English concept summaries on theme and subject. I think, let me see if I can find it. Characters and character foils. No, that's the POV cheat sheet. Let's see. Tone, voice, and mood. Tone. I know that I have something on theme versus subject here. Oh, nope, I saw it for 11A. It's actually for this lesson. Oh, okay, it is a 9A. I just missed it. Okay. Yep, so the theme is the central idea, but subjects are easier to identify because they're usually overt. And then we have the idea of Homer's Odyssey. So in literary works, the author gives you clues to provides clues to help the reader identify the theme, but it's barely stated outright. So you have to read the whole work to actually understand what a theme is. Let's see. Okay, it says, for example, the poem Learning to Read, the phrases used in association with learning, such as make us all too wise or precious words, all point towards the theme of the poem. So they're basically saying that the way that the author in the Learning to Read excerpt they give you here on slide 5, the way that the author talks about learning is in a positive light that lets you know that the theme is about knowledge and what learning can do for you, how powerful that is, because the phrasing in the story makes learning and knowledge seem powerful. So they give you a couple of strategies you can use here for identifying things. It basically just says you should analyze things like the title, words that pop up. So emphasize words, anything that's in italics, things that seem important. Repeated ideas. So if that comes up more than once, that helps you figure out what a theme is. One of the excerpts that they have here for you to try to figure out the subject and theme is Old Ironsides by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And they give you a little bit of a hint here with this photo. The poem Old Ironsides sings the praises, so that means good things, of the 18th century warship, the USS Constitution, which is still afloat today. So just keep in mind for theme and subject, it's a pretty quick topic, but it's difficult to understand. Themes are an overarching deep thought idea. The subject is just directly, what is this about? Now in slide 11, we move into meter and form with blank verse and enjambment. So they give you a list of things that you should be familiar with, and you can find a lot of these in the English concept summaries. There's a lot of poetry related things in here that can help you, forms of poetry, structure in poetry, types of poetry. You can go through all of these just to make sure that you understand what's going on in the course so far as poetry goes. Now it says, although American literature continued to develop through its use of original themes and styles in the 19th century, just to cut in really quick, remember the trick for finding out what years those are. Take the number they gave you, which is 19, subtract 1, that's 18, and then add double zeros to the end. So that would be the 1800s, that's the 19th century. The form and meter of American poetry still drew largely on traditional English conventions. So they're saying they still used a lot of traditional writing styles. And two commonly used conventions were blank verse and enjambment. So we're going to learn more about what those are. Now they tell you that blank verse is iambic pentameter. So I've gone over this and touched on it in a couple different lessons, but I'm going to repeat it one more time because I think it's important to reinforce poetry is a difficult thing to grasp. So to find out what sort of meter a poem has, we have to go back to the very beginning and start with syllables. So words are made up of syllables. Those are the distinct sounds in a word, the number of distinct sounds in a word. Now, the example I usually use is table. So we have table that has two sounds, tay and bull. So we have two sounds there. Now, when you're dealing with poetry, it's important to keep in mind what types of syllables we have. There are two types of syllables, at least so far as poetry is concerned. There are stressed syllables, that's the first one, and unstressed syllables, that's two. Unstressed is when you have a short sound that clips off at the end. You say it quickly, you almost rush through that part of the word. And a stressed sound is when the vowel sound stretches out in that sound. So for table, if you say that out loud, literally, and look at yourself, like in a mirror, I can see myself in the camera right now. Table, your mouth opens up for that first syllable, A, it stretches out, table, right? So table, since that stretches out, is the long syllable, it's the stressed syllable. And bowl would be the unstressed because it's the short, neat, snappy part. Now, when you're putting together verse, and you're putting together like patterned words, the types of patterns for the stressed and unstressed syllables matter. And there are names for different patterns of them. Now, we only need to know iambic pentameter. So that's only one kind. So I'm only going to focus on that. I'm not going to try to teach you all about like every single thing about poetry in this one lesson. But iambic is based on the word I am. So an iamb is a specific type of pattern with syllables. And that pattern is one unstressed syllable, so a short, clippy syllable, followed by a stressed syllable, so a longer syllable. When you have those two types of syllables together, you get one iamb. Now, pentameter here basically gives you the rundown on how many different times that pattern repeats in a line. There's no real easy way around this. The easiest thing that I would suggest you do if you're trying to figure out what type of meter something has is to just break up the line into syllables. And then from there, try to group together, oh, is this a long sound or a short sound? And then when you can figure out the pattern, like I would underline long sounds, that's usually what I do. And then take a look and see, oh, is there a pattern? Real quick, I'm gonna go back to the English concept summaries. Now, when we go to the Finding Meter PowerPoint, there is actually a table in here that tells you about what the pentameter and the other words that are related to that mean. So meter is just telling you that there is a meter here. The number of times the pattern repeats depends on what the prefix is. So if you look at this table, you can see pentameter here. Pentameter means 5. Penta means 5. And they give you these other ones here as well. So we have octa, that means 8. You could probably guess that. But each number has their own prefix. Mono for 1, di for 2, tri for 3, tetra for 4, and then we have hexa for 6, hepta for 7. So just keep this in mind while you're, counting syllables and trying to figure all that out. For iambic pentameter, specifically, what we are going to want is an iamb, so that's unstressed and then stressed syllable, repeating 5 times. Now, if you are a math person, an easy way to do this, if you were to get it on a test, would be for you to count the number of syllables, right? If we've got 5 of a 2-syllable thing repeating, that is 2 times 5, and that's 10. That means that the line will have 10 syllables in it. And if it has 10 syllables in it, there's a good chance it's iambic pentameter. There are other types, but this is just what we're focusing on for today. So iamb, that means unstressed and then stressed syllables. And then pentameter means that the pattern repeats 5 times. And if you look at these, the lines here for this example, you can literally count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you say it out loud, you can also hear each of these sections happen to be one syllable. Sometimes you have to split words in half to get the syllables that you need, but in this first line, it's pretty clean cut for us. There was a boy, ye knew him well, ye cliffs. Now that's not how you read it, but in terms of just understanding the groups of two syllables, I broke it up like that. When you read poetry, you're supposed to read it regularly. And these sort of things like finding out iambic pentameter, you would have to sit down and dissect the poem to get that. There was a boy, ye knew him well, ye cliffs, and islands of Winander, many a time, that kind of thing. So I'm giving you this information just so that you can recognize what they're showing you here. Blank verse, which is the subject of this slide, is unrhymed iambic pentameter. So it's when you have those 10 syllables in groups of two, unstressed and then stressed, but the end doesn't rhyme. If you look at these words at the end here, we have cliffs, time began, hills, alone, lake, hands, mouth, mint, and owls. None of those sounds rhyme. So that's what blank verse is. For your notes, blank verse is unrhymed verse in iambic pentameter. The thing is, it has to be iambic pentameter for it to be blank verse. If it doesn't have this structure, it's not blank verse. It has to be unrhymed iambic pentameter. So make sure that you try to figure out which lines are actually in blank verse, because on the test, if they give you a poem and they say which one of these lines or which one of these poems, maybe they'll give you a couple excerpts, which one of these poems is written in blank verse, or they'll give you one poem and say, is this written in blank verse? You can look at the ends of the lines and tell if they rhyme, but you actually have to look at the poem to see if it's in iambic pentameter, because if it's not, then it's not blank verse. Let's see. Blank verse serves several functions that other strict poetic forms do not. Primarily, the poet is allowed greater freedom by not being restricted to words that must fulfill a specific rhyme scheme. Next, we talk about enjambment. Now, enjambment is seen a lot. It's usually used with blank verse as well, but you can see it in other places too. The long story short on enjambment is that enjambment is when you have a sentence or like a clause, a part of a sentence that doesn't end or that doesn't end the line. So instead of having a full sentence in just one line in poetry, we'll break it up. So if one sentence or a clause continues from one line to a second line, then that's enjambment. Here, the definition they give you on paper is when a thought or a syntactical structure continues across two or more lines, it is called enjambment. The reader is encouraged to read through the line break to the next line without stopping. So that's the point of enjambment. It breaks up the poem in a way that draws attention to its form, but you were supposed to read through a sentence as if it's a regular sentence. So they ask you to consider the same poem again from last time, but this time we're not focusing on the iams or the meter or anything like that. They just want you to read through it and see if you can tell where it makes sense to start and stop based on enjambment. You have to actually take a look at the lines and see if you can figure out what is actually a sentence here. Which parts of these are clauses of sentences where like a comma would normally be, and do you stop there? Now on the next slide, they give you a couple notes about thoughts and phrases not being complete in a single line. So they give you the excerpt just to show you. At evening, when the earliest stars began to move along the edges of the hills, rising or setting, would he stand alone beneath the trees or by the glimmering lake? And then they show you what it will look like if you were to write it as a complete sentence. But because it's poetry, it's being broken up on purpose, one, for the type of structure that he's writing with the iambic pentameter. 2, to bring attention to certain ideas within the lines. And 3, to just keep it to poetic form. It's not supposed to rhyme or anything like that. So it says, reread the lines marked to indicate pacing while considering the purpose of enjambment. The enjambment across lines is indicated by a green arrow, and the end stop lines are indicated by a red stop sign. Now, remember, when you normally come across a comma in a sentence, you pause. But it's important to know the point of commas before you start getting into enjambment. Some commas are there to mark when you enter a different clause in a sentence. And even if you read it all together, there's a separate subject and verb happening in the clause. Some commas are there for you to pause instead of just marking sections of the sentence. So they've marked this for you to make it easier for you to tell which is which. So here we have, at evening, when the earliest stars began to move across the edges of the hills, rising or setting, he would stand alone beneath the trees or by the glimmering lake. So then they give you the whole excerpt here. The reason why I wasn't reading the entire thing before is because I wanted to wait for this slide where we can actually see where the enjambment happens. So we have, there was a boy, ye knew him well, ye cliffs and islands of Winander. Many a time at evening when the earliest stars began to move along the edges of the hills, pause. Rising or setting, he would stand alone beneath the trees or by the glimmering lake. And there, with fingers interwoven, both hands pressed closely, palm to palm, and to his mouth uplifted he, as through an instrument, blew mimic hootings to the silent owls. So this is basically a poem about a kid who goes up beneath the trees to call out to the owls. That's it. There was a boy, he does that. But it describes it in a very beautiful way. Glimmering lake, fingers interwoven, both hands pressed closely, palm to palm. Like, we get a lot of detail here. But they've marked for you what the different stop points are. There are 3 stop points here. Okay, let's see. Now they're going to ask you to put this stuff to use with the excerpt here, which is Thanatopsis. Now, they give you information about the author pretty much. It's the guy who wrote it is William Cullen Bryant. He was born in Massachusetts and he wrote a lot about nature. So that tells you that he's probably going to have a lot of nature references here. And Thanatopsis is his most famous poem. Now, on the next slide, they give you a little more information about this particular poem. So they give you some information first on the title. Thanatopsis is a Greek term. So they give you information about the actual title and where it comes from. The root, well, first of all, Thanatopsis is a Greek word. The root is thanat, which means death. And they combine that with the suffix opsis, which means view. So Thanatopsis means viewing death, but in this case, like translating it a little better, it means contemplation. So looking at death, thinking about death. When you view something, you can view it in your mind that's thinking about it. So they give you a little history on the background of the poem being published. It sat in his desk, in Bryant's desk for 5 years, and his father found it and sent it in, and it ended up being his most famous thing. So they give you some questions at the bottom of this slide to consider when you read Thanatopsis. What is the main theme of the poem? Is the poem written in blank verse? If so, what is the meter? So they want you to try to break it down. Which lines are examples of enjambment? They want you to think about which, if you can point out full sentences that carry across different lines. And why do you think the poet chose to name his poem Thanatopsis, given what you've read? Now they give you a little analysis after. Sometimes it makes sense to read the analysis before you go back and do, or before you go through the reading. But in this case, especially since there's a lesson activity before this, I think it's important for you to actually try to answer the questions to the best of your ability before you get spoiled by the analysis, because the lesson activity wants to know what you think and what you're able to put together. And even if it's not that much, even if you're not sure, it's better to try and then have the analysis like confirm or correct what it is that you felt like you saw in the poem, than to not put in any effort at all. But pretty much what they tell you is that the mood and tone of the poem are contemplative. And you can kind of tell by the title being Thanatopsis that it's a contemplative type of poem. The title indicates that death is the subject, and it points to the major theme of the poem, which is the contemplation and acceptance of the inevitable and equalizing nature of death. Now, I don't go over excerpts in these lessons because I need you guys to actually make the attempt to read them on your own. So I'm not going to go through the entire analysis. It's important for you to get that information on your own. If you are having trouble with the excerpt, you can book a tutoring session with either me or Miss Kathy Bahovic through your advocate or your mentor. But what I will say is that this slide number 22 goes over examples of enjambment from an excerpt of it. So they give you a sample so that you can understand where it actually took place in the poem instead of just guessing, in case you had a hard time figuring it out. And then on the next slide, they talk about the structure of the poem reinforcing the thoughts that are expressed. So there are lines, for example, stretching and pensive quietness, that gives you the mood. He chooses those words and the structure of the lines to sort of reinforce you concentrating and thinking about death along with him while you are reading through the poem. Okay, that's about it for this lesson. This one was pretty short. Themes and subjects, or theme and form in early American poetry, is not super hard. They just wanted to give you an example of what that looks like for you to work off of. So this last section is the language, the vocabulary. Now, you know what I always say, definitely write down the word and part of speech and the definition. But if you need help with the pronunciation, you can write that down. Usually the other parts of speech is a little easier to guess, especially if you're a native English speaker. But if you are not, or if you're having a difficult time figuring out how you would use this word in different ways in a sentence, you can write down the other parts of speech. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing because this is pretty much a short one. This is a pretty short one. I know you guys are probably glad to have a short one finally, because these last couple lessons have been pretty grueling, right? So as always, if you need help with your excerpt or with answering questions, feel free to book a tutoring session. If you just have a quick question, feel free to hit up the English department email. We are english@atsedu.net. And you can email us there. We'll give you a quick answer to your question. And if we need a longer session to talk with you, to get you the information that you need, we can do that. But other than that, this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.